Hello and welcome back to another Battle Royale podcast where evolutionary theories enter and only one survives. I'm your host, Hannah the Hurricane Davison, and today I have a special treat for you. This week we have a depression showdown. Before we get to the match and introduce the contestants, I'm going to give you a little bit of information over clinical depression. Also known as major depression or major depressive disorder, it is defined as extensive feelings of sadness, emptiness, or hopelessness with physical, social, and emotional manifestations that affect one's daily life. Understanding the evolutionary origins of depression would provide insight into improving treatment methods for the disorder and further the understanding of mental illness. And without further ado, let's get into the match. In one corner representing MDD as a means to inhibit aggression is the social competition hypothesis. In another corner representing MDD as a means to prevent diseases from spreading and reduce energy expenditure is the infectious disease theory. And my own personal theory, MDD as a maladaptive trait rather than an adaptive will also be entering the ring. Now that we have our contenders, who will win? The social competition hypothesis was created by Price and colleagues in 1994. And essentially, what this hypothesis is that depression is basically a big white flag. And it's a way to show that you have no aggressive behavior. And so it was an adaptation from our ancestors as a means for conflict avoidance. So instead of getting into an altercation that could cause you harm or even death, honestly, it would show as a sign of I'm no harm to you, especially someone that is of a higher social status than you. And so it's a strategy that allowed individuals to accept defeat in antagonistic encounters. So most of us, we don't like saying giving up, but this disease evolved in a way in order to prevent you from going into an encounter where you will lose. And it's a way to make up for what would be considered unacceptably low social rank. So there's also an interesting thing because it shows as a signal not only to those of higher status that you have absolutely, that you're not a threat, but it's a signal to your kin or your family as well that you can't really help out if there's any possible threat. Now, there are some issues, especially that I noticed when reading this paper, is that the symptoms that they describe, they don't really correlate with clinical depression. So let me explain. So there's a difference between clinical depression versus what a lot of people nowadays, especially like college kids, they're like, oh, I'm so depressed. A lot of the times it's not considered clinical depression because clinical depression has like certain parameters that you have to meet. One of them being like a minimum of 2 weeks of those prolonged sadness and a variety of other symptoms listed in the DSM-5. And a lot of the times within this paper, there was no distinction between clinical depression versus just like feelings of sadness, because we all have sadness and we all have bad days, but that does not mean that you are clinically depressed. Now, this also, it did not go into or take into account the severity of the symptoms of MDD, especially like suicide and self-harm are symptoms. And it did not take into account because that is very much not favorable for natural selection to push towards MDD when it leads to those. And there was nothing talking about genetics because MDD, there's not only has like an environmental effect, those around you, but it also has a genetic component, predispositions within the genetic code that could lead to you developing MDD. So with treating this, let's say a woman comes in and presents with MDD. So the symptoms could appear because, let's say she's having issues with her husband, and in order to prevent causing any conflict or that marriage from rupturing, she's going to just withdraw and have that MDD development. And this is more psychological rather than a medical treatment. So if you think of like holistic therapy, focusing on the mind, body, and spirit, rather than the symptoms or the illness. So treat the underlying causes rather than the symptoms. And now we're getting into the defense against infectious disease theory. So this was developed by Kinney and Tanaka. And what this is basically saying is that from the previous one, there's really no going into about like all of the severity of the diseases, the severity of this mental disorder. And so Kinney and Tanaka came up with an idea that the reason that this developed is because the costs outweigh the benefits. So the costs of depression are outweighed by the benefits, meaning specifically with defenses against infectious disease. And so an individual that has this disease or this disorder would prevent them from going out into the world and spreading this disease to those around them, but it would also prevent them from expending energy. And so they're not going to be going out and doing a whole bunch of activities. That energy is going to be conserved and converted into helping with this disorder, this disease that they do have, and their immune system. So now, again, this kind of explains why depression is seen, especially around like peak years of work and childbearing, because you think natural selection would work against this. But with this disorder, it's saying like, no, it has its benefits within these scenarios. And they also mentioned malaria and sickle cell anemia. So malaria is a disorder that is done with, it's mainly seen in Africa regions, and it is a protist that causes red blood cells to rupture. And sickle cell anemia is also genetically inherited. It's a monogenic, meaning only one gene causes it. And it's where the red blood cells, instead of being like circular, they're going to be kind of in a crescent shape or sickle shape. And both of these are not beneficial whatsoever. But within regions where malaria is prevalent, there's actually more sickle cell anemia that is seen, meaning like individuals will be heterogenic, meaning they have both regular blood cells as well as sickle shaped. And this is to prevent the pathogen that causes malaria from rupturing all of their red blood cells. And this can actually lead to increased survival within those regions. And this is one of the reasons they thought that, well, maybe MDD evolved in order to help us with these types of disorders, especially with infectious diseases that are like prolonged or chronic. And one of the ways to test this hypothesis is with those diseases that are prolonged and chronic, then they're going to be associated with depression symptoms, and the use of antidepressants will increase their immune system. Now, there are some issues with this theory. Mainly, again, they did not address the severity of the symptoms because death and suicide harm all are not beneficial whatsoever for the individual's fitness, meaning surviving and reproducing for that next generation. So, one, it did not address that. Two, antidepressants are very new, and there's a variety of different chemicals that cause different symptoms, and you can't really attribute it to one specific thing. So there's really no way to test the hypothesis. And because they're so new and it's just not been looked into as much. And antidepressants, again, they cause anti-inflammatory properties rather than what was expected to happen. So let's say you're looking through this lens and a patient comes in with depression. One, the patient is likely going to have a chronic disorder. And so to treat this disorder, to treat the depression, you're going to treat the disorder that they have. Meaning, if A causes B, then if you treat A, you don't have B. Next, we have the maladaptive theory. So this is basically saying that depression is an evolutionary mismatch, meaning that it holds no purpose whatsoever. And this can really explain the severity of the symptoms that we see today because it's just the effect of it being here, that there's no really cost-benefit analysis. It was just a result of the environment that we're in. And it could either be due to a time or space, a mismatch within those regions. So time is where the environment around us changes faster than the population can adapt, or space where the organism moves from one environment to where they're adapted to places where they are not adapted. So if you think of like a sweet tooth that you have, we all really crave sweets. And that's because the environment that our ancestors were in did not have access to those sugars as much as we do today. But the sugars were the carbohydrates, which are sugars, were quick energy source and very beneficial within that area. But nowadays, where we have access to quick sugar and vending machines, sugar water, basically, sodas, it's causes effect, and that can lead to the diabetes that we see today. And we can also see with our sleep cycle, our circadian rhythm. Whenever you affect the circadian rhythm, where you're supposed to be awake during the day, sleep at night, if you have like night shift, or if you're in regions where you don't get that light and day distinction, then you can see the development of depression. Now, the question is, why does natural selection not act? Well, it's because it hasn't had time to yet. Natural selection takes a long time in order to work, and whenever you don't have that time, then it can't really do its thing and help. Now, again, there are some issues with this, mainly being the fact that this still does not go into the fact about the genetic component of it. But other than that, it still does answer the whole, why are these symptoms so severe? And why is it seen so much today? Now, for treatment, you would mainly, again, look at the environment around them in like holistic approach, like their diet, sleep schedule, sunlight, exercise, who they're hanging out with, things like that. And you would adjust patterns in their life accordingly, and even go into medical or drugs adjustment if needed. So, who wins? I'm going to leave that up to you. So I gave you all the information, and you can make your own conclusion. Personally, I think all of these theories, they lack the integration of genetic and environmental interactions for depression, and it would be best to go for a case-by-case basis because humans were all, there's a wide range of us, and not every single case is going to be the exact same. And dealing with it from a holistic approach is very beneficial. So, and without further ado, I will have to say goodbye. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope to see you next time on the Battle Royale podcast.